Hi, my name is Lee Post, and I'm a senior at Bowling Green State University in the Integrated Language Arts Education program. And I'm really excited to be talking to you today about my honors project, which is all about teaching Marshallese immigrants. I stumbled into this project as I was home for the weekend because I had heard about local teachers who are having very unique experiences with Marshallese students in their classrooms, and I took the chance to reach out to some Marshallese community leaders as well to gain their perspective on this. So first of all, I just want to set apart and say that this presentation is not intended to stereotype Marshallese students in any way. As we know, no students learn alike, and all students bring unique challenges and successes to the table. So this isn't intended to stereotype, stigmatize Marshallese people, but rather to provide local teachers with a baseline set of recommendations that might be helpful for grappling with those cultural and linguistic needs, very unique ones that Marshallese students may bring to the classroom. I also wanted to put forth that this presentation is based in Marshallese perspectives, and Marshallese voices were kept at the center of this presentation, which was important for me, especially as a non-Marshallese researcher. So the question that I came up with was, what resources and pedagogical practices can help Marshallese students succeed academically, especially in the American education system? There were a lot of different ways that I could have gone with this question, but I decided to focus more on the academic side of it when I first began my project. To answer these questions, I first looked at Marshallese research, or research based in Marshallese perspectives, mostly by the following three authors is what came up. I found there was a superior lack of research, almost surprising lack of research. And I know that the Marshall Islands is small, but there is seriously a lack of information out there about how these students best learn and the kind of needs they bring to the classroom. To learn more, I also had some Babuentenado, which is a Marshallese kind of word for their storytelling, which is a very traditional, culturally appropriate way for stories to be passed down in the Marshallese culture. Obviously, this was over phone or over Zoom because of the wonderful pandemic that we're in right now. But I wanted to use those to bolster the information that I was learning from my research. And finally, for the language part of this, because I was also curious about where the Marshallese language differs from English and how that impacts Marshallese people who are currently learning English, I used a process called contrastive analysis, where I held up the Marshallese and English languages to one another to try to predict basically error analysis, where I thought Marshallese immigrants, Marshallese English as a new language, ENL learners might struggle with English concepts. And the language contrastive analysis that I did was mostly based in the perspectives of Bender, the Marshallese English Dictionary, and Muñeco. So this is the essence of this project, right? This phrase, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce that a lot, but the idea of it is that if someone knows all the navigation signs, they will never get lost at sea. And so this project really intended to help in any way to try to smooth over some of the cultural and linguistic barriers between American teachers and their Marshallese students and families. So I think that if we truly understand Marshallese, seek to understand Marshallese students and their needs better, we will be able to make them feel more welcome in American classrooms and help them succeed academically. This project is interdisciplinary because it is branching across a couple fields, actually. So obviously it's got its roots where I am in education, because it is considering Marshallese students in particular and their kind of conflicts they might face within the classroom. However, it also has a lot of background in communications and the idea of cross-cultural communications and how we can alleviate some of the impact or negative indicators of cross-cultural communication that can come forth when two groups of people don't fully understand one another. And of course, linguistics is also a huge part of this project through the contrastive analysis that I'm doing. So I'm just going to dive right into some of my findings, which will include some systemic barriers outside the classroom, cultural and linguistic barriers within the classroom, and some of my findings from my contrastive analysis. So first of all, I just wanted to say that there are a multitude of systemic issues that Marshallese people will likely face upon coming to the United States. Most of these to worry about are language barriers, acculturation, because the Marshallese and American cultures, or Western culture in general, as I'll talk about some more later on in this presentation, are very different. Housing, because of non-nuclear family systems, can be an issue. Just deep-set poverty is something else that comes forth a lot in Marshallese research. A lack of access to healthcare, especially because under the Compact of the Free Association treaties, Marshallese immigrants are free to live indefinitely within the United States without a visa, which means they still pay taxes, they can work and live here without a visa, but unfortunately they are not able to obtain most forms of healthcare, most federal forms of care, which has led to problems. And just in general, a lack of federal aid for them because, again, they're not qualified technically as United States citizens. And part of the reason why I'm bringing this up is because a huge piece of this is the United States government's own impact on the Marshall Islands, because essentially the United States once used the Marshall Islands as a nuclear testing facility. They essentially used the Marshallese people as lab rats, and they set off this 67 different nuclear tests, including the Bravo shot, which is depicted in this image. And this obviously had detrimental impacts. The fallout had detrimental impacts on not only the Marshallese people, but on their lands, leading to large spread health indicators that are still not going away today, devastation of the land, and ultimately displacer from ancestral lands. And so many Marshallese immigrants are moving to the United States. And as this particular quote says, this is the direct consequence of an overwhelming prevalence of disease and lack of economic self-sufficiency in Micronesia, caused in part by US policy towards the region. So I feel that in a lot of senses, as American citizens, it is our responsibility to do what we can to empower Marshallese immigrants to have a place within American society, to feel welcome within American schools, because this is ultimately something that our government did to the Marshall Islands that we will never be able to reverse. So one of my major findings was that I thought there was a need for cultural competence, especially after hearing the issues described to me by local teachers. And part of this is understanding where the Marshallese and Western cultures differ so distinctly. And the first is that Marshallese culture is based in an idea of shared problem solving. It's a very collectivist culture where people work together or have very large family units that work together to achieve goals. Compared to the United States' more individualized culture, this can be a very different mindset to have in daily life, and this is reflected in the education system as well. A second piece of this is respect for authority. From a young age, many Marshallese kids are taught that it's disrespectful to speak up directly to an elder unless directly spoken to or asked a question. And so this may also play a role in the classroom. I know I was reading the works of one of these researchers who was actually a principal in the Marshall Islands, and they were speaking about this experience where they were yelling that they're so frustrated that no Marshallese students would speak up and answer their questions, and that's in part because of those cultural norms. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that first you need to have that rapport between a student and explicitly explain your expectations for participation in class. Third thing is familial obligations. In Marshallese cultures and a lot of other cultures outside the United States, when your family is sick, you stay home with your family. Or when something is happening, you are with your family, and that takes precedent over work or school or any other commitments. And that's not always the way we think in American society. We tend to think that unless you are sick or unless there's a definite tragedy, that you should be at a place and you should be there on time. So that is something to consider as well, stressing the importance of attendance, especially of all things. And the polychronic time system is a fourth thing to keep in mind. So the United States focuses on more of a monochronic system, meaning that we adhere to very strict schedules, and we are always very conscientious of time, arriving to things on time, and keeping strict schedules. And in the Marshall Islands, it's not like that at all. Time is more laissez-faire. If you show up to an appointment a little late, if half an hour late, it doesn't matter. A starting time is not a definite starting time. So this might be something that you discuss with your students and have to establish with them. Another thing to keep in mind is language barriers. So a lot of Marshallese immigrants will come to the United States several grades behind with language barriers because they have not gained access to the same depth of English exposure in their homes. Although English is taught within Marshallese schools, most Marshallese students do not hear English as the predominant language at home, meaning they have not reached a level of proficiency either in English. But at the same time, with such an emphasis in English in the curriculum, a lot of students don't have the time to develop full proficiency in Marshallese or their indigenous languages either. So there can be kind of intense language barriers that may come up in the classroom. And the last thing that I just wanted to address is differing academic expectations. So the school system in the Marshall Islands is different than the one in the American education system. So you might have to explain certain concepts like homework, rationalizing why that's important or why we think attendance is important. These are just things to keep in mind in the classroom that may pose barriers if teachers are not careful based on the research that I have conducted and the thoughts of local Marshallese. So as far as the contrastive analysis goes, Marshallese and English, to no one's surprise, are very different languages. They do have the same typology, both follow an SVO pattern, which is nice. However, in Marshallese, there are no words for to be or to have. There is no word for like, he is happy today, you know, he is happy today. It's just, he happy would be the entirety of that sentence here. So there are also no words for to have too. You would say, there is the book near me, instead of like, I have the book. So it's interesting to consider how that might come into play when you're learning the language, because I feel like that would be a hard concept to explain. So the trick that I think might work, however, is there's a word pod that is used specifically when referring to location, and it kind of functions similarly to a to be verb. So if you would like to read more about this in my research, you can kind of see how this is structured within a sentence. But that might be one trick for dealing with the lack of to be or to have verbs in the Marshallese language. So the alphabet of the Marshallese language is actually a Latin alphabet in the newest orthology, but the issue is that there are actually several letters missing when compared to the English alphabet, and there are also several letters in the Marshallese alphabet that English does not have at all. So letters that English has that Marshallese doesn't, however, are C, F, G, H, Q, S, V, Y, Z. So that's quite a few letters, and these are obviously going to be letters that you would have to focus on Marshallese students with, especially beginner students, but maybe a process of repetition with older students as well. And the most important thing, I think, however, that will pose the most barriers is that Marshallese does not conjugate verbs. Verbs remain unchanged no matter who is saying, though. So, isha karabge, I collect shells, versus quo karabge, you collect shells. Karabge, the verb there, is not going to change. So it's going to be a process to familiarize new ENL students with kind of the process of conjugating verbs and the importance of a verb within every sentence. What Marshallese actually does instead is declension of pronouns. So essentially each pronoun is attached with a suffix or an affix that shows the tense of that particular pronoun or the person doing it. So these pronouns are also genderless, which could pose some interesting ideas, but I think could be illustrated with images, could be easily explained to students. They're modified by the number of people as well, and they have an exclusive and inclusive we. So depending on if you're like, me and my friend are going there versus me and you are going there, there would be a different we, inclusive versus exclusive. But as you can see in this chart here, which you could definitely provide to students, pronouns are conjugated, or there's a declination. Oh, I just forgot the word, sorry. Declension, sorry. There's a declension of pronouns rather than a conjugation of verbs, and you can kind of see the process of how pronouns are consistently conjugated within the Marshallese language. And this could be useful for drawing contrast for ENLs between Marshallese pronouns and English pronouns, and using them to teach it, but also showing the contrast in certain sentences. Luckily, the object pronouns, although there are two sets of them, also function very similarly to English object pronouns, which is nice because when you are focusing on object pronouns, you could just provide this kind of comparison and use that to teach students. As far as the phonology goes, the spoken component of Marshallese, there are definitely some letter distinctions that we talked about that you need to be aware of. I think when teaching Marshallese students, we're trying to draw upon English and Marshallese together in order to teach English, and it's that consonants differ from their English counterparts. So some words, as I'm going to show on one of the following slides, some words change, and the sound of the words change depending on where they are in the sentence, or they might not have the same sound as their English counterparts. And in general, Marshallese speaking and letters, as noted by Rudyard Gold, have more of a darker back of the throat sound than English. So the B and the P are kind of interchangeable, but it makes more of a P sound at the beginning of the words, but a B sound anywhere else. The D makes more of a rolled R sound, kind of like a Spanish R. A J can make a multitude of sounds, so kind of an S, SH, sh, a CH, and a H sound. The T makes more of a D sound when between two verbs, and the W sound is only pronounced as a W when it's at the beginning of words. So these are important alphabetical phonetic differences to keep in mind as you are working with Marshallese students. Finally, there's also the idea of fricative phonemes. So I'm sure you noticed when we were going through the letters, Marshallese does not have any fricative phonemes, which are those sounds that are made by making like a hushing or hissing sound through your teeth, the V. So I said V instead of V, but those particular sounds are going to be different between these two languages. As far as nouns and articles go, nouns are also proper versus there are proper nouns and normal nouns. In Marshallese, just like there are in English. However, Marshallese does not inherently have count versus non-count nouns, which is important when it plays into articles, because in English, articles are distinguished because, or can be changed based on if a noun is count or non-count. There are three article-like articles in the Marshallese language. These three actually change depending on if the thing being modified, the noun being modified, is an animal, a person, or an inanimate object, which is interesting to say the least. But definitely articles are not the first thing you should be focusing on with ENLs. Something that, you know, articles don't really impact the overall meaning of something as much as something like verb conjugation would. So that's definitely a more important focus, but it is also interesting, and you could definitely draw upon these articles when teaching English articles as well. So tense and tense markers. In Marshallese, there are no present, past, or future continuous tenses. There's no difference between I run and I am running, or I ran, or or how do I say that? I run and I am running. I sing and I am singing. There's no distinction there. Do I know verb tenses? Yes, I do, but there's no distinction there. There's also more of a reliance on context for meaning making instead of like a more distinct set of grammar rules and grammar patterns. So because of this reliance on temporal verbs, like already, they're like, yes, if you put already in a sentence, we can tell it's something that happened in the past. Well, English doesn't exactly work that way. And the other thing to keep in mind is that some of the words will get switched around, even though it does follow an SVO typology. So if you took the word we took, or took the sentence we took all the classes, and you put it in Marshallese or word order in a sense that made more sense, in a word order that makes more sense in Marshallese, it would come out something like all of the classes I was took. So you could see why this might be a little confusing, especially if students don't have as much familiarity with these tense markers. They may change tense markers in the middle of a sentence. So this is just important to keep in mind, especially if you are working with more advanced students who are ready to learn about the difference between present tense and then present past, future continuous tenses. So some recommendations that I have, and these were kind of already scattered throughout the presentation, but again, based in the advice of Marshallese researchers, Marshallese perspectives, and local community members' perspectives, to build rapport with students. This should be a no-brainer. But once you establish a relationship with these immigrant students, this is especially important because a lot of immigrant groups have isolation, more social isolation from their American peers or other groups of other ethnic groups. So it's important to keep in mind that you might be their sole contact for English for the time being. So it's important to build a good relationship with them and show them that this is a place in America where they can feel welcome and can feel free to succeed and fail. So explicitly explaining classroom procedures, especially attendance, homework, participation, and their importance, not only explaining them, but also rationalizing them. If you are going to argue to a Marshallese student that homework or attendance are really important, it's probably important to try to explain why as best you can too. To get students more used to the classroom and to build upon that kind of collectivist thought process, because students may be more used to that shared decision making that is more utilized in the Marshallese culture in the school system. You may consider utilizing small cooperative groups with rotating roles and partners. And I would advise not immediately expecting them to speak out in front of the class unless you've established rapport with them and have established that this is something that is not disrespectful to you as their elder. You might also consider, to help students overcome kind of those time differences, helping students create a personal agenda or a schedule or something that emphasizes the importance of timeliness to them and their families. Again, that family part is really central to this. So reach out and involve students' families, even if it means finding someone who is willing to translate with you. If you can do that, that would be a great way to not only get students involved, but also get parents involved in the process of their child's education, because family is really, really important to these particular groups. So also, if you learn a few basic phrases to speak with students, this would be an amazing way to also build rapport with them. This was one of the recommendations of a local Filipino teacher who actually taught in the Marshall Islands for over a decade. And what she said is that if you even just greeting students with yakwe as they come into the classroom, it lights up their smile, their face with a big smile. So that might be something you consider as well, like reaching out in olive branch and learning a few phrases. So just on a whim, I will probably not be the best at this, but I have done my best to learn a couple phrases, and there are resources for it scattered online. So if you would like to learn how to say a couple basic phrases, there's a YouTube channel called Teaching Marshallese, I think that's what it's called. So you might consider checking that out. But otherwise, if you want to have a Dora the Explorer moment, you can try repeating these after me. So the word for hello and goodbye is yakwe. How are you? Emin more. Emin more. I'm good. Emin. Emin. You can kind of see the emphasis that I tried to depict in the pronunciation as well. I'm so-so. Ipwe, ipwe. I'm not doing so well. Nana, inana. You're welcome. Kinjush, kinjush. Thank you very much. Comotada, comotada. Yes, ayat. No, jab, jab. I don't know. Iyai, iyai. I don't understand. Imelele, imelele. That would be I understand. Sorry, I don't understand is iele, iele. So these are just a few phrases that you might consider using with your Marshallese students. I thought it was really fun for me to try to pronounce them and struggle through them more or less. And for these language recommendations beyond that, if you can, give students tangible resources such as the ones that I have created that try to emphasize the differences between Marshallese and English, try to give them a starting spot as they build up their English skill. Emphasize the alphabet and its sounds, even with students who already have experience, so that they become more familiar with pronouncing those sounds, especially the fricative phonemes. And focus on verb tenses and conjugations and building vocabulary. This is not something I mentioned on there, but these students, as many impoverished students do, might have a sort of limited vocabulary just due to a lack of exposure to a lot of things we encounter every day in the American world. So that might be something you focus on as well. So those were my findings. I hope you found them interesting. To address some weaknesses of this project though, of course, I'm a non-Marshallese researcher. I did bring in Marshallese perspectives, but at the end of the day, I am not Marshallese. I do not speak the Marshallese language, and that does make some barriers in this project. There's also the unpredictability of contrastive analysis. So even if I held up the Marshallese and English languages and tried to predict where they might differ, this is not assured that students will actually encounter these issues. They may encounter these specific issues because of the way their language is structured, but they may also have issues entirely outside of these with learning English, or they may have completely random things that are unrelated to their language. So it's not entirely predictable in that way. Another, I think, downfall of this project is that I was unable to verify a lot of information in person because of the pandemic, which may have tampered with kind of the results or the conversations that we were having. And of course, all of these recommendations are not necessarily applicable for all students, as all students learn differently. However, I do think, or I at least hope, this project had a couple strengths, including that it's based in a community real life situation. And I hope these resources that I've created will actually give local teachers more of a grasp on the unique cultural linguistic needs of their Marshallese students. It's based in a context that I think this is really important, and it's also based in Marshallese perspectives, as I've been saying. Another thing that I tried to do, which was difficult for me because I'm not as familiar with linguistics, was to try to break down a lot of the linguistics jargon in contrastive analysis, the little contrastive analysis that has been done by like 2 researchers as they're floating on the other side of the world. And I kind of tried to break that into really accessible terminology. So hopefully it will be very accessible for local teachers to use. And those were my goals. So thank you so much for hearing my presentation today, and thank you to Dr. Weaver and Dr. Sherry-Wells-Jensen for your help on this project. I've really appreciated it. And of course, this couldn't be accomplished without the generosity of the Curse Grant, who made some of the translations in this project and made me able to compensate the Marshallese people who helped me and so generously donated their time to making this project come to life and helping local teachers understand and empower their students better. So I hope you have a lovely day, and thank you for listening.